Well, lately, as we've been continuing to work through the Gospel of Mark, we've been regularly exploring famous Bible stories. Stories like Jesus calming the storm or feeding the 5,000, healing the sick, even raising the dead. And so I feel like every week I'm beginning by saying, this is a famous story. But what I'm really enjoying about studying the book of Mark in particular is that Mark is almost always the least popular source for these famous stories. In fact, Mark is often the least popular gospel, which means that we are less familiar with his perspective on things. I think this is to our advantage, though. Because as we try to focus almost exclusively on the gospel according to Mark, we get to view these famous stories from a different perspective than we're used to, and sometimes even see them in a whole new light. And I would say never is that more abundantly clear than with today's passage, which is the story about Jesus walking on water. This is found in Mark chapter 6, beginning at verse 45. Now, if you're familiar with Bible stories, you probably know the main beats or story points of this miracle. Essentially, the disciples are in a boat on rough seas late at night while Jesus has stayed behind on the shore to pray. And then at some point, Jesus simply walks upon the waves, upon the sea, to come out to them. And as you know the story, when the disciples see him, they're terrified. They think he's a ghost. And then Peter asks, if it's really you, Lord, then ask me to join you on the water. And so Peter steps out of the boat, and at first he's doing okay, but then he gets nervous and he begins to sink and he panics and he cries out for Jesus to save him. And then, of course, the climax of the story is the words that Jesus spoke to Peter when they're back in the boat. You of little faith, why did you doubt? And so this version of the story that we're familiar with is pretty much the account from Matthew chapter 14. And it's the one that really appears in every children's Bible storybook, Sunday school lesson, and most sermons that we encounter that cover the story of Jesus walking on water. If we were to consider the other Gospels, Luke doesn't tell this story at all, and John tells it very, very briefly. He basically mentions it in passing. However, Matthew is actually the only one who mentions Peter's experience in the whole thing. So it may feel a little strange to have Mark leave a detail like that out, something so incredible, so remarkable. You would think it's a real showstopper of a moment and maybe even the central point of the encounter. But what you need to understand is that Mark isn't saying that didn't happen as we read the story today. In fact, if you remember all the way back to the September when we were introducing the book, many scholars believe that Mark's primary source for his gospel was Peter himself. Which means, if anything, that Peter didn't see that part of the story as the main point. Or maybe it was a point of embarrassment for him, and he didn't want it included. But either way, he still thought this story was worthwhile, even without sharing that part of it. So instead, what we're going to see here is that the reason Mark's account skips Peter's stroll and then swim is because Mark has another lesson for us to learn there. And that lesson is directly tied to last week's story, which was the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. And then, although I've usually made it a habit to avoid discussing how these stories appear in the other Gospels throughout this series, in this case, I think it actually lends weight to understand the difference about Mark's Gospel, but it also lends weight to understand that when both Matthew and John tell this same story of walking on water, even though some of the things are in the account are different, such as mentioning Peter or not mentioning Peter, even though they don't focus on the same central theme as Mark, they both agree that this story happened on the night following the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fish. And that's going to be key to our understanding this morning, because Mark uniquely sees those two events as directly linked. So all of this is to say that this morning we will not be learning about Peter's faith, because Mark has something else for us. So I think we should begin by reading Mark's account of the story found in Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 52. And so just for context again, the preceding verse, verse 44 from last week, is the final verse of the story of the feeding of the multitudes. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. So this is what happens immediately the next verse. If you remember, part of the reason for the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 is that it was already very late, meaning there was already little time to travel to nearby towns for food. So by the time they have distributed that food to all the people, and everyone's eaten, and they've collected the 12 baskets of leftovers, we can assume that it's already nighttime. So what we need to understand is that this does not happen the next day. It doesn't happen later that week. The first word of the passage we're about to read after the verse I just read you is the word immediately. So this is what happens next. Starting at verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. You see what I mean? No mention of Peter in particular. Instead, Mark gives us the climax and meaning of the incident as he sees it in verses 51 to 52, which is the last verses we just read. They were completely amazed. They had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Does that seem strange to you? It's one of those things I don't think I've ever noticed before, probably because I really only know Matthew's version of this miracle. The loaves are, of course, referring to the miracle that had just taken place hours before in feeding the 5,000. But you have to ask, what does walking on water have to do with bread? Well, I think that the first thing we should consider is not actually the feeding of the 5,000. We will get to that. But how similar this story is to the one we've covered in the past in Mark chapter 4, which is the story when Jesus calms the storm. That story also happens at the end of a long day of dealing with the crowds. Jesus and the disciples, if you remember, they're on a boat just offshore, and Jesus is using that boat as a platform because the crowd is pressing right to the edge of the lake. And because the crowds are so large, at the end of his teaching time, rather than trying to land amongst the crowd of people, Jesus suggests that they simply cross the lake to reach somewhere a little quieter. If you remember the rest from several weeks ago, Jesus falls asleep because he's exhausted. A storm stirs up, the disciples panic, and then Jesus commands the storm to be still and essentially scolds the disciples for panicking while he is there with them. Mark 4:40 reads, he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Now this time, at the end of an even longer day, Jesus suggests the same thing, but he insists that the disciples actually get into a boat and make their way along the lake without him. And he stays behind to find a quiet place to pray. I suppose that he's not being mobbed by the crowd this time. It says he dismissed the crowds and they listened. A lot of the other times in the other stories we've read, they don't listen, they don't leave him alone. But I think maybe this time they listen because one, it's really late. It's probably even dark already. And two, if you remember what we learned last week, everyone is actually stuffed, satisfied, full of bread and fish after having raced to his boat to beat him to the landing site where the miracle took place out in the wilderness. As you remember, Jesus and his disciples meant to just go away outside of town to a quiet place where they could kind of catch up and rest. But the crowds follow them along the shore and they get there. They beat them there. Now, we know in this story that the seas get rough again, just like it did last time. Only it doesn't seem to be quite as bad as last time, as the story when Jesus calms a storm. We know he's going to tell them again that there's nothing to be afraid of, and we know that the storm is going to be calmed again as soon as Jesus gets in the boat. So the biggest difference this time, other than the walking on water, of course, is that because the weather is bad but not as bad, the disciples aren't bailing water this time. They're not panicking this time, but instead, we're told they're straining at the oars. And that word is maybe too soft. I'm told that the Greek here implies torture or torment. They are rowing as hard as they possibly can, and even harder than that. They are digging deep. But it isn't working out for them. They're actually being blown off course. So how do we know that? Well, in verse 45, we were told that Jesus sent them ahead of him across the lake to Bethsaida. But if you peek ahead at verse 53, you're going to find out that when they finally land, it's actually at a place called Gennesaret. And those two places are not on the same side of the lake. In fact, it's pretty well understood because Luke mentions this, that the place where the feeding of the 5,000 took place was actually just outside of Bethsaida. So it was just in the wilderness outside of that town. So in the previous story, they had used the boat to simply skirt the shore a little way down to a quieter place outside of town, close enough that the crowds were able to watch their progress and catch up with them easily, but still far enough that the crowds couldn't get back into town for food after dark. And this actually makes sense. It all kind of comes together if you consider that Jesus, in this story, was planning to just catch up with them on foot after his time of prayer. He had simply sent them back to town. Now, Bethsaida is in the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee. So the Sea of Galilee is sort of longer north and south than it is east to west. So, from your perspective, northeast would be over here. I think that's right. And Gennesaret is kind of over here. So the wind pulled them out deeper, and they blew them all the way to the west side of the lake, almost midwest side of the lake, far from where they had planned to end up. And this means that even after Jesus arrived and the waves calmed down, it seems like they were so exhausted that even though the sea was now calm, they still decided they had to just land at the closest place. They actually won't make it back to Bethsaida until halfway through chapter 8. They're going to travel all kinds of other places before they get finally back to where they had meant to go that night. So the disciples are out in a storm. Maybe not quite afraid of death this time. It's hard to say. But these experienced sailors are still working at the oars to the point of torture to try and make it to the place where they'd agreed to meet up with Jesus. And you can imagine what that would feel like. Obviously, Jesus doesn't have a cell phone. They can't call if they get lost or separated, right? They had a plan and they had to stick to that plan. Otherwise, he was going to have no idea what had happened to them. They didn't want to lose him. They didn't want to let him down. We're told that while this is happening, Jesus is alone. He's up on a mountainside and he can see them out there straining because the wind was against them. And so shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. And then we're told they were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. their hearts were hardened. So again, what do the loaves have to do with this story? Do you remember last week's theme? It was a single word: abundance. If you remember last week, Jesus had been teaching and traveling and healing together with his disciples. And then at the start of Mark chapter 6, at verse 7, we read that he had begun to send them out in pairs to do those things without him, and yet not without him. Remember, that was the lesson last week. We looked at the story of God sending Moses to Pharaoh to set his people free from slavery in Egypt. And when Moses asks, "Who am I to do something like that?" God responds, "I will be with you." As in, who you are is the one the God of the universe will be with. Back in Mark 6:8, the instructions Jesus gives the disciples when he sends them out 2 by 2 is take nothing for the journey except a staff. Which we didn't mention last week, but must sound familiar because Moses also is sent with only the staff in his hand and his brother to do the talking. So just like Jesus' disciples, 2 people, nothing but their staffs. No bread, no bag, no money in your belts. And when the disciples return from their short-term ministry experience, exhausted, Jesus then commands them to feed an army of people. You give them something to eat. If they had no food and no money when they left, what do you think they have now? And yet Jesus demonstrates abundance because they are the ones who he will be with. Are you seeing the pattern here? Jesus does ministry with his disciples, and then he sends them out to do ministry on their own, after which they still fail to see the abundance they have access to, even when it seems like he's not with them. And then likewise, we saw earlier, Jesus takes his disciples out into a storm to demonstrate to them that there's no need to fear the storm, to fear chaos and death itself, since he is with them. And then later, he sends them back out into the boat to remind them of the abundance they have access to, that there's still no need to worry, even when it seems like he is not with them. He wants them to understand that they still have access to abundance. Why? Why is this so important for them to learn? Well, it's important because pretty soon, Jesus is going to turn his focus toward Jerusalem and the cross. And there's going to come a time when it's really going to seem like he's not with them. And so here's what I find so fascinating about this story. We're told that in this story that the disciples' hearts are hard, like the Pharisees. In fact, the next story in Mark is going to return to the conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders. And in Mark 7, verse 7, Mark is going to record Jesus quoting Isaiah 29:13. "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." But we've covered this topic a few times before already, stating that we often see the Pharisees as the villains of the story, but what they actually were are tragic figures. Because in all of their rules and moral posturing, they had worked so hard to draw close to their God that they missed him when he was right in front of their faces. And by referencing the hardness of heart, Mark is equating the disciples with this same condition. They are straining at the oars. They are literally working with all of their strength towards God, towards his command to go ahead of him. And yet, in their effort, in all their torment, doing it under their own strength, they are failing to understand who Jesus is. They even fail to recognize him when he's right before their eyes. Instead, when Jesus appears, they're afraid, and yet the tragedy is, in that moment, they have once more failed to properly fear him. Now, again, this is another theme we've talked about, repeating itself. When we talked about Jesus calming the storm, we spent a whole second week talking about the idea of fearing the Lord. Proverbs 1:7, for example, says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Well, Jesus is discipling them, but despite the glimpses of illumination they have demonstrated in certain moments, they're still failing to learn this lesson. For they had not understood about the loaves. Now, to review what we've covered before, the Hebrew word translated as fear in Proverbs 1:7 means fear, exactly how it sounds, terror or dread. The feeling you experience when you're in the presence of something that can end you. A sinking realization that your own mortality is fragile, like coming across a mountain lion while hiking in the woods. It's an acknowledgement that you are not master. Your life and destiny are not in your own hands. You are small and vulnerable. We like to imagine God as a loving father. We forget that he is also a wrathful lion. I heard it said once that knowledge becomes wisdom when it recognizes the Creator. Through Jesus, they had fed the multitudes, and yet they had not understood about the loaves. They had still not recognized the Creator. That's what it means to fear God, to recognize your Creator, to understand where you fit in, that He is Lord and Master and we are not. That is the first step to true worship. The second is to hold that knowledge in your mind while realizing that you have a relationship with your Creator. That the wrathful lion is also your loving Father. And then rather than straining at the oars after what you think you ought to be pursuing, you learn to rest in that knowledge. Wisdom is ultimately knowledge that breeds humility and surrender. As John the Baptist said, he must become greater, I must become less. That same source I quoted a moment ago went on to say that knowledge sees beyond scarcity and reveals abundance. What he means is that knowledge is transformative. We know that in the world, through knowledge, trees become shelter, grain becomes bread, minerals become steel. And in the knowledge of the Lord, hearts of stone become flesh. The potential was there all along, but it took knowledge to unlock it. In the same way, the knowledge of God can turn death into life. The power that formed the heavens can be in our hearts. The disciples were giving it all that they had, and yet the waves were too powerful. They had the best of intention, but they were being blown off course. And no matter how hard they tried, they're being blown further and further away from their goal. Now, Jesus, being compassionate, seeing that they don't understand that the one who commands the winds and the waves is still with them, he goes out there. He goes out there to simply put himself in their sight, to pass by them, to reveal himself. Because they're straining towards his will under their own strength, when all they needed to do is rest in his abundance. So what does this mean for us? I hope you can see it on some level. One of the major themes of the book of Mark is right here in front of us, to understand that we can work so hard at pursuing God under our own strength and by our own means that we can miss him entirely. And for that matter, we can be blown entirely off course. As the Lord once said to Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulty. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Something that is often amazing to us when we read the Gospels is how long it took the disciples to get it. When Jesus was right there in front of them, right there with them, amongst them. And yet, how often do we find ourselves straining at the oars under our own strength, pushing towards what we understand to be his will so hard that we fail to actually rely and rest in his power? So as you know, as I've already mentioned this morning, our AGM is coming this Thursday, our annual general meeting as a church. It's going to be my 10th annual meeting with you as your pastor. And as I've been working on this message this week, I've been realizing that over that decade, there have often been times where I felt that strain. And I know you have too. That we've often been straining towards a new building, straining towards a need for more staff, straining towards a desire for more thriving small groups, and straining towards a desire for more impactful ministries, exhausting ourselves, feeling like we can't seem to make progress, fighting the wind and the waves. And so I think maybe the lesson for us today is that it is time to see beyond that scarcity so that God can reveal his abundance. We need to understand about the loaves. And what does that look like? I don't know. But what I do know is that we've often focused on feeling like we don't have much in our hands. And yet God is telling us to feed the multitudes. He's telling us to lead them to freedom, to understand that we are a church that God is with. So, would you commit to praying this week for our church? Even if you can't make it to the annual meeting, if you're going out to do other things, would you commit to praying for our church this week as we head toward that meeting? That in the midst of the waves and wind that is against us, we would look up from the oars and we would see the Lord upon the waves. That we would rest in this knowledge and that we would allow it to become wisdom in the fear of God. To see beyond the scarcity so that God can reveal abundance. Let's pray for that together right now. Lord, I thank you for the Gospel of Mark. We're often wonder why we would need 3 or 4 versions of the same story, and yet, Lord, you have so much to teach us that one version isn't enough. So, Lord, we just thank you for opening our eyes to the way Mark understood this, to the way Peter understood this. And Lord, I just pray that it would sink into our hearts as we think about what it means for us as your people. That we would not strain towards you, but rest in you. In your precious name.